Chapter 6 Nihon-Ja. An hour passed without any sign of the remnants of the Emperor's army. Shuken came to a decision. "We can't wait any longer, cousin. Every minute we delay lets Arasaka get closer to us." "I don't like deserting my men. They fought in my name after all. It's a poor reward for them if I abandon them," Shigeru replied. "Poorer still if they see you taken by Arasaka. Reito-san can ride back and lead them to join us. We can arrange a rendezvous, but right now you must get on the road again." "Reito said that Arasaka's men were several days behind him," the Emperor pointed out, but Shuken was unconvinced. "His main army, yes, but in his place I would have sent out fast scouting parties to search for you. They could be upon us any time. After all, the survivors from the Ito garrison are traveling on foot and bringing their wounded with them. They'll be moving a lot slower than a mounted scouting party." Reluctantly, Shigeru agreed. The men from the escort began to dismantle the two pavilions and pack them away. Reito and Shuken put their heads together over a map and agreed on a rendezvous point where Reito should lead the survivors. "Wait for us here," Shuken told him, pointing to a village marked on the map. "We'll make contact with you." He was all too aware of the possibility that Reito and the rest of Shigeru's men might be followed and captured. Best if they couldn't tell Arasaka exactly where the Emperor had gone to ground. Reito met his gaze, understood, and nodded. "Look for us in a few days," he said. Then, bowing hastily to Shigeru, he mounted his horse and rode off down the trail to the south. The others mounted and turned their horses' heads north, starting back along the trail that had brought them down from the summer lodge. After a few kilometers, they came across another trail that branched off to the west and led down into the valleys. Shuken, riding in the lead, reined in his horse and waited while Horace caught up with him. He indicated the new trail. "We'll take this track. It will take us to the turnoff for Iwanai, where you'll leave us." Horace nodded unhappily. "I hate to leave," he said. "I feel as if I'm deserting you." Shuken leaned over and grasped the young warrior's forearm. "I can't imagine anyone I'd rather have by my side, Orsan," he said. "But, as the Emperor says, this is not your fight." "I know that," Horace replied, "but I don't have to like it." Shuken smiled grimly. "Look on the bright side. At least the rain has stopped." Then he spurred his horse into a canter and rode to resume his position at the head of the little column. George moved up to ride beside Horace. He shifted in his saddle, standing in the stirrups to ease his aching backside. George was not an accomplished rider, and Shuken had been pushing the pace for the last few hours. The attorney had been bounced and jounced continually in the saddle, and he was sure his behind would be black and blue. His thigh muscles were aching and cramped. His discomfort was physical, but he knew that Horace was feeling an acute mental anguish that was just as bad, and he wanted to take his friend's mind off it. "Are we nearly there?" he asked, hiding a smile as he voiced the age-old complaint of children on a journey. Horace couldn't help grinning in return. "You didn't sign up for this, did you?" he said. "You probably thought it would be all polite meetings and formal banquets in the palace at Ito." "Too true," George replied, with some feeling. "It never occurred to me that we'd spend our time galloping up and down mountains on tracks that a self-respecting goat would avoid. If I'd— Look out!" he yelled suddenly, and leaned over in the saddle to shove Horace to one side. Horace heard a savage hiss as something flew past his face, missing him by inches. Then he saw George swaying, a long arrow buried in the upper part of his arm. As he watched, George slid sideways from his saddle and thudded onto the rough, churned-up earth of the track. Their attackers came out of the trees on either side. The initial volley of arrows had taken down 3 of the escort, as well as George. Now 9 swordsmen charged in at the small party. Horace drew his sword and shrugged his shield round into position, his left arm slipping through the straps and finding the hand grip with the speed of long practice. It was a well-staged ambush, he thought. The enemy had let the advance party go past, poured in a volley, then charged out of the trees while the small column milled about in confusion. 3 of the attackers converged on the Emperor, who was riding in the middle of the column, a few meters ahead of George and Horace. One grabbed the reins of the Emperor's horse, and as Shigeru drew his sword and struck at him, the man ducked under the horse's neck to avoid the blow. Instantly, the other 2 were on the Emperor like jackals on a deer. They grabbed his arms and pulled him from the saddle, the sword falling from his hand as he hit the ground. His retainers were caught by surprise, engaged with the other 6 attackers. Horace made his decision in a split second. His normal instinct would be to attack on horseback, but he wasn't riding Kicker, and he had no idea if this horse had been trained for battle. Besides, the Emperor was on the ground and he'd risk trampling him. He threw a leg over the pommel and dropped to the ground, dashing forward to protect Shigeru. One of the senshi had raised his sword in a 2-handed grip, aiming a downstroke at the helpless Emperor. Horace's sword was heavier than the katana that the Nihon-Ja warriors used, but it was also longer, and Shigeru's attacker didn't factor that in. He thought he had just enough time to kill Shigeru and turn to face the onrushing warrior. He felt a moment of surprise when Horace's horizontal stroke took him in the ribcage, exposed as he raised the sword high, and smashed through his lacquered leather armor. Then he felt nothing. Horace sensed rather than saw the second man swinging a diagonal overhead cut at him from the left. He pivoted in that direction, and his shield seemed to move of its own volition, intercepting the razor-sharp blade with a ringing clang. He felt the super-hard steel of the katana bite into his shield, sticking for a fraction of a second. As it did, he stepped forward, cramping the man for space, and kicked flat-footed into the side of his knee. The man's leg collapsed under him, and he stumbled forward with a shrill cry of pain. A quick thrust cut off his cry, and he fell at Horace's feet. In a fight against multiple enemies, it was fatal to face in one direction for too long. Horace spun 180 degrees, shield raised, just in time to block a thrust from the 3rd man, the one who had seized the Emperor's reins. Before Horace could retaliate, the man threw up his arms with a choking cry. He fell to his knees, shock and surprise on his face. Behind him, Shukin was poised with his sword ready for another stroke. But it was unnecessary. The assassin pitched forward, face down in the wet earth. Horace looked around quickly. The rear guard had closed up and were taking care of 2 other senshi attackers. He heard the crashing sound of someone running through the undergrowth on the downhill side of the track. At least one of their attackers had got away. Shukin sheathed his sword. Then he helped Shigeru to his feet. "Are you all right, cousin?" he asked anxiously. Shigeru brushed his concern aside. "I'm covered in mud and winded, but otherwise unharmed, thanks to Orsan." He smiled his gratitude at the young Araluen. Horace shook his head. "I'm glad to be of service," he said, a little formally. Horace was always uncomfortable when people thanked him for doing what he considered to be no more than his job. He sheathed his sword. The senior man from the rear guard had approached and was talking to Shukin in rapid Nihon-Ja. "Are they Arasaka's men?" Horace asked the Emperor. Shigeru nodded. "That's the Shimonseki crest," he said, indicating the stylized owl emblazoned on the attacker's breastplates, over the heart. Shukin moved back to join them. "My corporal counted 9 of them," he said. "2 got away. My men killed 4 others. Orsan accounted for 2, and I finished off the 7th. He cast a contemptuous glance at the sprawled figures on the track, then grudgingly had to admit that the attack had nearly been successful. "They were well organized. 2 parties of 3 moved to cut off the advance and rear guards, while the remaining 3 attacked you, cousin. I don't think they reckoned on Orsan's skill with a sword. That was their main mistake. We lost 2 men, and 1 was wounded in the volley of arrows they fired." His words brought a terrible realization to Horace. "Oh God!" he cried. He swung round and ran back along the track to where George had fallen from his saddle. In all the action, he had forgotten about the scribe. His heart surged with relief as he saw the thin figure sitting upright beside the muddy track, painfully nursing his right arm, still impaled by a long, white-feathered arrow. His sleeve was soaked with blood and his face was pale, paler than normal, but he was alive. Horace dropped to one knee beside him. "George," he said, the relief evident in his voice. "Are you all right?" "No, I am not," George replied with considerable spirit. "I have a whacking great arrow stuck through my arm, and it hurts like the very dickens. How could anybody be all right in those circumstances?" Impulsively, Horace went to touch the arrow, but George jerked away, then howled as the abrupt movement sent pain coursing through his arm. "You saved my life, George," Horace said gently, remembering how his gangly companion had shoved him away from the arrow aimed at him. George grimaced. "Well, if I'd known it was going to hurt like this, I wouldn't have. I would have just let them shoot you." "Why do you live this way?" he demanded in a high-pitched voice. "How can you bear it? This sort of thing is very, very painful. I always suspected that warriors are crazy. Now I know. In future Whatever it was he planned to do in the future, Horace never discovered. At that moment, shocked by the pain of the wound and weakened by the loss of blood, George's eyes rolled upwards and he slid over onto his side. Horace looked round to find Shukin studying the wounded scribe. "Might be a good thing," the Senshi leader said. "We'll get that arrow shaft out while he's unconscious." George remained unconscious for a few minutes, but it was enough time for Shukin and the Emperor's healer to remove the arrow from the wound. They applied a salve to the entry and exit wounds and bound his arm with clean linen. Shukin observed the result with a satisfied look. "It should heal cleanly," he said. "The salve will take care of any infection, although the arrow was new and seemed clean enough. He will have a sore arm for some weeks, though." As if on cue, George's eyes fluttered open. He looked around the concerned faces looking down on him, then frowned. "My arm hurts," he said, and Horace and the others burst into relieved laughter, which did nothing to assuage George's feelings. He regarded them indignantly. "It may be funny to all you heroic warrior types," he said. "I know you all make a habit of just shrugging off this sort of thing, but it hurts." Horace gently helped him to his feet and led him to where his horse was waiting patiently. "Come on," he said, helping his companion into the saddle. "We've a way to go yet." He was glad that George, normally a garrulous companion, didn't feel like talking as they rode towards the junction with the track to Iwanai. Horace had a lot to think about, and he wanted to prepare his words carefully. He knew George would argue with what he had in mind, and he knew that George was trained in logic and the ability to express thoughts clearly and precisely. Eventually, the time came when the Emperor and Shukin reined in their horses and indicated a steep, narrow track leading downhill to the southwest. "You leave us here," the Emperor said. "It's about a day's ride to Iwanai this way. I doubt that you'll run into any more of Arasaka's men on the trail. Take care when you reach the port, however. Stay out of sight as much as you can until you're aboard your ship. One of my men will guide you, Shukin said. But Horace shook his head. Not one of your senshi, he said. A servant will be fine. You need all the fighting men you have with you. Shukin nodded, acknowledging the wisdom. Good point. Very well. One of the servants can guide you. Horace sat silently as George made his farewells. The Emperor, he noticed, looked quizzically at him while this was happening, perhaps sensing what Horace had in mind. Eventually, George slapped the rein on his horse's neck and turned his head towards the steep, narrow track. Come on, Horace, it's time to go. Horace cleared his throat uncomfortably. That's the thing, George, he said. I'm staying.